want your soul.
Did you know that up until 1889, there was one extra country in Western Europe? I doubt it. After its great purge from our history, our library beneath Lion holds the only records it ever existed, and trespassers there are shot on sight. The country's name was not recorded, only that it occupied land connecting Italy and the Iberian Peninsula with colonies in Ethiopia and Liberia. Judging by the estimated death toll, its population at the time of its consumption was about 13 million. Guess it could have been worse. Certainly a small price to pay when bargaining with an entity that could have easily ended all life on Earth, unless a satisfactory compromise was met. We even offered it all of humanity's collective memories of the country and its inhabitants. It thought we were just sweetening the deal. It didn't realize we were really just getting it to pull off the biggest cover-up operation in history on our behalf. I shudder to imagine a fate like that. Everything you know and love devoured and utterly forgotten by the world. I wonder if people who knew someone from the place could still feel their absence, even if they couldn't remember them. That abstract, directionless sort of feeling of missing something that was never there, like a gap in a jigsaw puzzle with no piece to fill it. But what terrifies me most is the possibility it may have happened again. After all, just a few months ago, I woke up one morning and couldn't help but wonder why there was a ring on my finger. That's the kind of knowledge you just have to live with when you've retired from an organization like the one that once employed me. It's taken many forms throughout history, attaching itself to existing organizations like a parasite and siphoning off men and resources. But its current iteration is known as Interpol, Incident Response Team 6. It's called IRT-6 by those who are not in the know, and Deep 6 by those who are. And in their eyes, everything they do is justified by their motto, Quod nesse est fecimus. I've taken refuge somewhere outside even their jurisdiction, but I have no delusions that this will prevent them from tracking me down and euthanizing me like a dog for leaking their dirty laundry. But the world needs to know. And besides, what have I got left to lose? I have 1,000 stories I could tell, leaving me spoiled for choice. Yet for some reason, there's this one job I haven't been able to get out of my head. I don't know why. It seemed like a regular mission at the time, the equivalent to what you'd call an average lazy day at the office. It should have been utterly forgettable, but somehow, it still shows up in my dreams to this day. Back then, I went by the call sign Agent Blackbeard. I wasn't in a good place mentally when I was recruited. I hadn't shaved or combed my facial hair for a year, and comparing me to an old pirate captain was actually the generous option compared to calling me Agent Hobo, which would have been more apt. I've cleaned up a lot since then and now sport nothing more than a 5 o'clock shadow, but the name stuck. On this particular job, I was being shadowed by a rookie. Her assigned nickname was Agent Etoll, an Afro-French Guinean woman with round-rimmed glasses, a dark 3-piece suit, and curly black hair all done up in a bun. Usually the newbies graded on me, but I liked her. She was professional and deferential, and her bushy-tailed idealism reminded me of myself when I was green. Equipment check-off, I declared, and she instantly set to work providing me with a full inventory of her gear, testing each to ensure its functionality. I was quite impressed by how fastidiously organized her setup was. Far cleaner than my mess of a rucksack. Still, I didn't act impressed. In fact, my expression was downright disappointed. "Aren't you forgetting something, newbie?" I could see the exact moment her heart sank. And I nodded. Tell me, how do we keep our sidearms? With shaky hands, she produced her Glock 19. Cocked and locked, sir. Wrong. It's cocked, locked, and stocked, rookie. I feigned exasperation. Christ, don't tell me you've already forgotten one of the 3 basic rules. It was an absurd statement to make, but I said it with enough confidence, and it was just close enough to sensible that it sent her into a panic, digging through her bags in a frantic bid to figure out what the hell she'd missed. I'm sorry, sir. I don't know how I... Her panic then turned into confusion, though, when I couldn't help but crack up laughing. Ha, at ease. I'm just yanking your chain. I gave her a clap on the back. Some hazing is all. Your gear's perfect. She stared for a while. Oh, ha. She gave a half-hearted attempt to fake a laugh. And I made a note to myself. Not much of a sense of humor on this one, I thought. Our vehicle weaved through the back alleys of Paris, past herds of crackheads and ladies of the night, as if digging through multiple layers of sketchiness until finally reaching the rock bottom of the city, where no one dares to go. There, stained by piss and booze, was an unmarked concrete storage container, hiding a tunnel which led deep into the earth. Ever been through the catacombs before? No, sir, but I've heard much about them. Well, I hope you ain't afraid of the dark, or a few skeletons. Of course, if you are, this job was probably never for you in the first place. Well, I can handle it, sir. She couldn't hide the hint of nervousness in her voice, though. If I may ask, why have we come here? Well, our soothsayers have reported sensing some Category 8 angelic activity somewhere in northern Germany, and we're here to meet a friend who will help us narrow down exactly where. So stay close, I explained. And sure enough, she was smart enough to stick an inch behind me like a lost puppy as I navigated those labyrinthian tombs. Just another reason I liked the newbie. The Paris catacombs are a world of their own. Those public maps you've probably seen online, they only cover the first level, and even then, it's only half of it. And we made sure of that. After all, we don't want any average Joe knowing that with a few turns, they can meet a 3-headed eel who grants wishes, or a commune of cannibal mole people, or a poltergeist who claims to be the ghost of Margaret Thatcher. There's an entire supernatural ecosystem down there, and I could write novels explaining. But on this particular day, I didn't care about any of that. I made a beeline towards a single entity, an ancient goddess who was one of the greatest allies of Deep Six, as well as being one of the most putrid creatures I'd ever laid eyes on. We referred to this entity as the Saint of Parasites, and it was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. It was about 10 meters tall, and sat upon a concrete pillar emerging from what looked to be a bottomless pit. It looked like a woman, more or less, immobilized by her own mass. I'd call her morbidly obese, but perhaps it'd be more accurate to call her bloated. The way bodies can become lumpy and distended from pent-up gases over time. In fact, she overall looked and smelled like a corpse that had been left to rot and soak in the sewer for months. And through the pox-ridden transparent skin of her belly, I could catch glimpses of intestinal worms the size of pythons, alongside the silhouettes of even stranger organisms. Beneath that was an array of basketball-sized oozing pustules which insect things suckled upon like teats. Etol lost her lunch right away, and I couldn't blame her. In fact, I'd brought along a bucket for that very reason. Once she composed herself, I showed her how to properly bow in supplication. As we did so, I finally opened the kennel, allowing a heavily dosed sow to come waddling drunkenly out. We both cut our fingertips to mark the pig's forehead with our blood, and presented it to the goddess with a rehearsed chant, De furis vitae, connivium tibia fero, et tuam infinitam famine extinguat. As we continued chanting, a tentacle-like appendage slunk lazily free from between the thing's lips, oozing slime as it searched for its meal. It's similar to a frog's tongue, I think, and the moment it touched the pig, It gripped it with the inescapably sticky goo and began reeling it in like a fisherman would. My ears rung from the pig's terrified squealing as it was pulled towards the foul thing's maw. I couldn't blame it, really. I can't imagine a more terrible fate. But in an instant, it was gone, and its squeals went silent, replaced with the gentle humming of the she-beast. The QR offering had been accepted. I stood and declared loudly, "Obsecro, fair sponsum, rubrem nobis." There was a long pause, and then something else emerged from between the thing's lips. It was another woman, this one even taller and stick-thin with long black hair, sporting forearms and red body paint covering every inch of her skin, not stained by foul effluence. Every part of her was far too long, from head and limbs to even mouth and eyes, as if you'd taken a picture of a human being and stretched it out vertically about 10 times. She slowly slid free from the goddess in a way that defied gravity, eventually suspending herself horizontally above the pit below, held by the sewer thing only by her feet. I stared into those eyes, each almost as tall as myself, and asked my question, "Ubi est spiritus sanctus?" And she began to give her answer in a form of sign language, transitioning robotically from one sign to the next. And just like that, the grim transaction was over. I thanked them both humbly for the information. The red woman then slid back to from whence she came, and the goddess waved us off with an impatient glare. As we weaved back through the catacombs, I could tell Etol was still lost in a nauseous daze, her brain reeling from the sheer amount of what the fuckery she'd just witnessed. But she played it off like she wasn't bothered. "You know, you don't have to act tough," I noted. "I mean, seeing what you just did for the first time, it can screw you up something fierce. If you want to talk about it, just say the word." "Oh, no, I'm fine, really," she coughed, turning away from me. "You warned me about all this beforehand. You know, what this job would be like, and so I feel prepared. You prepared me." "Really? Because nothing can prepare you for your first meeting with the saint of parasites." I'll be honest, when I was a newbie, first time I met her, I started weeping and puking so hard I screwed up the whole ritual. I then reached over and gave her a pat on the back. "You did pretty good, all things considered." I found that telling an embarrassing story was always a great way to break the tension when talking to newbies, and sure enough, she laughed and seemed to perk up. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that," she said. I gave her a wry smile before returning to business, checking the map on my phone. Anyway, our friend pointed us to a small club on the outskirts of Berlin by the name of Untot, and that's where we'll find our angel. And she whistled. "Wow, that's amazing, sir. How did you even know what she was saying?" I laughed. D6 agents like us get to learn a hell of a lot of languages. It's pretty much the one single perk of the job. And after all that, I made sure she got in session with her D6 appointed therapist before our flight to Berlin a few weeks later. The first thing I noticed about Untot is that it was impossibly quiet. The DJ was practically asleep. The dance floor a ghost town, and what few patrons there were dressed incredibly prudishly and had no interest in drinking. The bartender looked bored to tears. She was a punkish young woman, complete with a pixie cut, black fishnets, a black t-shirt, and the thickest black lipstick and eyeshadow I'd ever seen. "Evening," she greeted before her eyes drifted downwards. "What's with the fanny pack?" she asked. I then tucked my messenger bag behind me. "Well, that's not really any of your business, is it?" I then took a seat. Now might be a good time to mention I was never that good at precisely remembering long past conversations, nor at translating them into English, but I'll do my best. Anyway, evening. The name's Jacob Henley, and this here is Ida. I gestured to Etol. Both names had been made up on the spot, of course. "Oh, the mysterious type, I see," she giggled. "Nice to meet you, Jacob. My name's Juna." But of course, I already knew that. I knew everything about her. Before I even walked into this building, I had extensive intel on every single staffer. Do you put any effort into guarding your privacy online? Most people don't. It's insane what the IT boys can dig up with a modicum of effort. I knew she shared her first kiss during a picnic at Mauer Park and spent the whole rest of the day in a panic, wondering whether she'd wasted it. I knew she volunteered at a soup kitchen during her weekends. I knew she ran a Tumblr blog dedicated to her homemade plushies. I knew she was beaten as a kid. I knew she was 2 years clean from a heroin addiction. I knew she was in a virtual support group for chronic depression. And like the trained sociopath that I was instinctually devising ways to use all that knowledge to manipulate her, if the need should arise. Nice to meet you too, Juna, I lied through my teeth. She smirked. You too, Mr. Jacob, you said it was? It's been quite a while since we've had feds come strolling through our door. I didn't react in the slightest, but Etol went doe-eyed. Don't look so surprised that I can tell. You two've got a certain gait about you, she said. If you're here checking to see whether we've been selling spirits to toddlers and pushing E on the side, I can assure you you're wasting your time. Boss man keeps this place on the straight and narrow. And she laughed. But if you're here for a drink, well, I'm obliged to never turn away a customer. After all, I'm sure kicking people's doors down can get a bit stressful. I noticed the slightest hint of sarcasm and venom in her tone. She was suspicious of cops, and in this case, she had a right to be. Oh, you don't know the half of it, I replied with a chuckle. But I'm not in much of a drinking mood. I just have a few questions for you. Her eyes then narrowed. I don't chit-chat with cops. If you're hoping I'll rat somebody out, you're barking up the wrong tree. Well, that much is obvious, Juna, and I know better than to waste my time. I cut in, raising a hand to silence her. Just tell me, are you the spiritual type? She glared. No, I can't say that I am. But you've met a lot of religious people lately, haven't you? And that actually seemed to give her pause. Religious? Her eyes fluttered. Yeah, I have actually. I'd knocked her off her guard and I knew it. Well, you seem disturbed, so what's bothering you? A nervous cloud fell over her and she glanced around furtively, her voice lowering to a whisper as she leaned in. I don't know. We've just been getting these folks in all the time lately. It's like they're trying to turn this place into a Sunday school or something. The way they talk, it feels kind of cultish. She shivered. It scared off a lot of our regulars. Boss went out to talk to them and get them to screw off, but by the time he came back, somehow they'd suckered him in too. You know, he's got a shrine built in his office now. A shrine. Can you believe that? But then she quickly caught herself and pulled back. I've already said too much already. I smiled and replied, well, you've said everything you needed to. Thanks for the help. Angels always like to hide out in dens of sin like this, precisely because they knew it was the last place most people would think to look for them. But they couldn't help themselves but to leave their traces everywhere. This was the first nightclub I'd ever been in where I saw more rosaries than cleavage. I spoke to the DJ next, although it wasn't much of a conversation. He seemed to have an issue with me barging into his booth. Sir, I'm sorry, but you really can't be up here. I lifted a flap on my coat, retrieving my suppressed MP5 from its holster on my side. Before he had time to register it, the barrel was already pressed against his chest. You sure about that? I whispered. He went silent, but not an ounce of actual fear showed on his face, only a sudden blankness. Still, I nodded to Etol to plug a USB stick into his setup and start messing with his controls. When I looked back, though, he was different, changing. Flesh beginning to pop and bubble, eyes and features drifting slowly out of place. His stare piercing my soul as protrusions of flesh began bulging out of his head and forming out into shapes nature has never before saw fit to make. I didn't hesitate. All it took was one burst to turn his head into mangled ribbons of flesh. The thing about suppressors is, while they're not nearly as silent as in the movies, they're extremely good at making the sound of a gunshot less recognizable to untrained ears. Still, the patrons turned up their heads, startled and confused by the crackling of the sonic boom. It only took Etol another moment to finish her work, and then the club's smooth jazz was replaced with a reading of Inno a Satana, a 19th century poem designed specifically to whip angels and their flock into a frenzy. The results were as predictable as they were immediate. The things seemed to be physically anguished by blasphemy, writhing and groaning like vampires in the sun. As they moaned, they began to change, as if their flesh itself was beginning to strike out against the sound. It melted off of them and reformed, like metal flowing into a molten fluid shape before solidifying into their true shapes. Have you ever seen the crystals of bismuth? The way it forms out into those chaotic cubical geometric shapes, aligned with intricate patterns that almost look like fractals. Imagine something like that, but coated with a tight layer of flesh. Eyes and mouths and ears and clumps of hair arranged randomly across its surface. Now, you have a rough mental image of what every club patron's head had morphed into, as they all chanted and sang in some unnatural choir over and over again. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The only human left was Juna, who had the telltale expression of a person whose entire perception of reality was crumbling all around them. I couldn't imagine what it was like for her. Even I, experienced as I was, felt the shiver go up my spine at the sight of the crowd, clenching my jaw to suppress the budding terror. Each bullet seemed to shatter parts of them like broken glass, yet still they seemed to take 2 or 3 short bursts to take down. In seconds, they'd close the distance and threaten to surround the station, forcing us to reposition. Etol clearing a path while I kept them off our flanks. What they lacked in weaponry, they made up for in doggedness, charging at us without fear or pain. I took to kneecapping them to slow their relentless advance. We took positions behind the bar, and by this point they were so close I had to grab one by the throat to keep it from sticking me with a blade, smashing it against the bar and unloading 9 rounds into its chest. Eventually, Etol's weapon went silent, and I assumed she'd run dry before realizing that, like the bleeding heart she was, she'd gotten distracted comforting Juna, who was curled up in the fetal position, sobbing beneath the bar. Oh God, what the hell is happening? Oh, please, God, I don't want to die. Please don't let me die. Etol had taken a knee, and I laid a hand on her shoulder. We're going to get you out of here, okay? Just stay down. I roared, Etol, eyes up. She glanced up just in time to see the thing lurching towards us with a knife. Her Glock was out in an instant, putting 6 rounds through its chest and 4 more through its skull once it was on the ground. The tide of battle began to turn as their numbers dwindled. Their lack of self-preservation became their weakness, as they practically marched themselves into our lines of fire with wild abandon. Soon, they were having to stumble over the shattered bodies of their own compatriots, just to try to make it to the bar. Me and Etol became perfectly synchronized, acting as one, covering each other's flanks and timing out our reloads. And just as the battle seemed won, as if on cue, another figure came stumbling slowly from the manager's office. The boss man Juna had referred to earlier looked to be a short, portly man, in what had once been a nice suit, were it not now stained with chunks of meat. It looked like something was tearing its way out of him from the inside. A massive gash almost bisected him, extending from his left shoulder down to his right lower belly, a few strings of tendon being the only thing holding him together. His skin was pale, eyes wide, blood dribbling from his lips. He went up in a shower of viscera as the thing inside of him broke free in a beam of shimmering divine light. The thing hovered in casual defiance of gravity and beamed in such a way that the eyes ached just to glance at it. Its outermost layer was composed of 3 concentric rings in constant rotation, each composed of human arms gripping each other's elbows, piercing golden eyes along every inch of skin. Upon a blanket of glittering, white feathered wings in the center was in a mass of flesh, constantly shifting between the heads of men and lions and eagles and oxen, all united only in being hairless and furless, eyes and mouths wide as if silently screaming. We called these entities the Passover Angels. You've probably figured out I don't scare easy, yet no matter how many living nightmares you've faced, the sight of an entity you can barely comprehend the sight of, a thing which so blatantly defies all of the natural laws upon which our psyches rely, will shake you to your core. I don't care if you're Billy Badass. This is a primal terror baked into our DNA, as if every single one of your ancestors comes screaming at you to run. Even with all my conditioning, I could feel my heart lodge itself in my throat and my vision blur. For a moment, I was a little boy again, quivering in terror at what waited wheezing on the other side of my closet door. And then one of its minions plunged a pocket knife in my side. I cried out, kicking its feet out from under it and dumping a mag into its chest once it was on the ground. Christ, get a hold of yourself, I thought as I limped frantically for cover, the world spinning around me, dizzy with vertigo as I felt as if teetering on the edge of a sheer cliff. Etol, to her credit, got her shit together even before I did, distracting the entity with a quartet of rounds. I soon joined her in the assault, not out of any belief that our bullets could harm the angel, but rather in hopes of distracting it until an opening presented itself. Tables and knives and chairs were tossed all about by some invisible force as it proceeded towards us. Some debris dodged only by a matter of inches. It seemed to sense that I was the point man and shifted its focus to me entirely. Every single one of its 1,000 eyes met mine, and suddenly I was swaddled in a blinding light. Then a sound came slamming into me like a tidal wave. I was the only one who could hear it, yet to me it seemed powerful enough to knock me back like a shockwave, so deafening in its noise that even the gunshots had sounded like whispers by comparison. My ears rung with 1,000,000 divine voices demanding me to end my own life, in the name of all that is good and holy. My body began to move of its own accord, acting without my brain's input, slowly raising my gun to my chin. But Etol tackled me to the ground just an instant before I was able to pull the trigger. It was ultimately Juna who saved us, not through any intention, but rather through the string of blasphemies and profanity that naturally rolled off her tongue at the sight of the unfathomable horror looming over her. The thing seemed to wince, as if pained by her very words, and its countless eyes all turned to her. Before she even had time to regret her mistake, it was upon her. With telekinetic force alone, it restrained her against the ground with impossible strength, as her screams reached a fever pitch, writhing and wailing as she fought against the inevitable. The thing's countless eyes rolled back into their sockets, and a drooling maw emerged from that formless mass of flesh in its center. Her screams turned to gasps as the angel began to steal something from her. It looked to be a foggy breath being sucked into her mouth, into its. But in reality, this breath was her very life force, her body withering as it was vacuumed out of her. In seconds, she was visibly drained, eyes sinking into their sockets, her body becoming bony and emaciated. And all the while, I snuck up behind the thing and finally produced what my messenger bag had kept hidden, a scrawny young lamb kept in a chemically induced state of catatonia. In one smooth motion, I pulled my blade across its throat and then wrung out its neck like a wet towel, showering the entity below in a chunky spray of red blood. The blood of the innocent sizzled against the entity's flesh as if it had been poured onto a hot grill. Its shriek sounded like the crack of thunder, shaking the building to its foundations, glasses falling from shelves and shattering against the floor. Its form began to bubble and melt, tears oozing from its many eyes, its rings spinning frantically as it tried to turn and flee. But my gun was already braced upon my shoulder again, and this time, each shot tore through the weakened beast with a splatter of golden ichor. It was always bittersweet to witness the end of something so ancient. Sometimes I wonder how many millennia the immortal being had wandered this earth, only to finally die at our feet as its form crumpled beneath 2 volleys of 9mm parabellum rounds. Ask anybody in the deep six, and they'd all take it for granted that angels were simply pure evil. Looking back, I don't know how it never occurred to me they might just have been fighting back after we'd driven much of their kind to extinction. But I wasn't so interested in such moral quandaries back then. I was distracted by a more pressing horror. Etol was resuscitating Juna. I knew I should have said something, that I should have stopped her, told her to leave the bartender to die, but for reasons I'll never understand, the words were just caught in my throat. Maybe it was due to the sheer passion with which Etol performed her work, tears welling in her eyes as she frantically performed chest compressions on the gaunt and unconscious woman. I couldn't bring myself to stop her. I only prayed to myself that Juna would just pass on to save me from having to make that call. But instead, she suddenly sucked in a breath. Etol beamed with relief as Juna coughed and sputtered, life returning to her weakened body. She was shell-shocked, but cognizant. It took a few good minutes and a few swigs of water before she even had the energy to sit up. Once she could speak, though, she had nothing but gratitude. Oh God, thank you. Thank you so much. I was so scared I thought I was going to die. What even has happened? Shh, you're still disoriented. We need to get you someplace safe. Etol hushed her frantic gibberish with a finger to her lips. Exhausted beyond measure both physically and mentally, all Juna could do was lean forward and wrap her in a hug. Thank you, she whispered. You saved my life. I could see Etol's eyes growing foggy, even wiping a tear from her cheek. Hell, I almost felt a tear coming on myself. The local police didn't even spare us a glance as they stormed the building. After all, we had jurisdiction over pretty much every country on Earth, besides the big NK. World governments were content to pinch their noses at our methods as long as we got results. For the same reason you'd hire an exterminator to flood your home with toxic gas for you. Odious as it was, at least it beat having to deal with your pest problem on your own. The cleanup crews set to work, making sure these events would never see the light of day. As far as the public records were concerned, Untot will never have even existed. We helped Juna weakly wobble her way to the truck, and me and Etol shared a moment. You know, sir, to be honest, I'd been having some doubts about all this. You know, the job, she said. But this was exactly what I dreamed of when I joined up with you all. A chance to really make a difference, to actually and truly help people. Something I could never really do at that desk job. So I want to thank you. I know I should have dispelled that silly notion and reminded her that we serve a higher priority and that helping people had never really been a part of our job description. But I just couldn't bring myself to wipe that smile off her face. Maybe that had been the first clue I was going soft. I rested a hand on her shoulder, the closest thing I'd ever managed to a hug, and for the first time she genuinely smiled at me. I'm glad, and I'll take good care of Juna, so don't you worry about her, okay? And in a sense, I wasn't lying. My conversation over the phone with my handler the next morning, however, was much less pleasant. I was all too familiar with the sound of the thick drawl of the American South oozing through the phone. Howdy, Black. Congrats on the op, he said. Heard they pulled at least 24 bodies from the place. Christ, that angel bastard was in deep, but you never let us down. Actually, Barber, there is one loose end. He groaned. Wonderful. That's just what I like to hear. and his voice dripped with sarcasm. Well, it's nothing really. It's just that one of the angels, Code Greens, made it out of the building. She only took it for a few seconds, so the transformation won't have any effects on her mentally, but it will be visible in 48 hours, probably. Oh, like a walking goddamn billboard screaming supernatural, he cut in. Would you mind telling me how in the fuck she made it out of there alive? Agent Etol rescued her, sir. All but brought her back from the brink of death. There was a long pause and then a scoff, as if he couldn't believe a word he was hearing. Well, why in the hell would she go and do a thing like that? I sighed, taking a deep breath. I really didn't want to have this conversation right now. Look, I've got the Code Green thing right here. I'll just take care of her myself. He raised his voice. No, forget that. Etol's a big girl. You tell her to go clean up her own goddamn mess. She's not ready, Barber, I asserted. Not yet, okay? But soon. He fell begrudgingly silent at that. He knew what I meant. We always worked rookies in slow, like the old parable of the frog in the boiling pot. We pulled back the curtain gradually, inch by inch, so they didn't realize how deeply they're being lured into the mire. We study them, form a psychological profile, and determine exactly how to gaslight them, manipulate them, exploit their fears and insecurities, how to break them until they're utterly under our control, and by the time they truly realize what they've signed up for, it's already too late. Well, we're going to have a long conversation about this during your debriefing, Black, he concluded bitterly. Get it done. But before I could respond, he'd hung up the phone. I'd taken Juna back to her apartment, let her huddle on the couch all wrapped up in a thick blanket. She didn't seem to question why I was dressed in surgical PPE. She didn't have the mental faculties for it, I figured. She was barely recognizable after what she'd gone through, shivering like a beaten dog and emaciated enough to look anorexic. I still don't understand what I saw. I never thought anything like that could exist. Were they even people? She asked. I gave her a pat on the back. Just calm down and relax. Everything will be explained over time once you're okay. You're going to be placed under the agency's protection program, which will take over your treatment and ensure nothing unnatural is ever able to find you again. You look fatigued. Would you like me to make you some coffee or tea? She nodded. Just water. She flashed me a weak smile as I went for the kitchen. Thank you so much for all of this, really. I greatly appreciate it, she said. My stomach twisted into a knot at her words. Oh, please, don't thank me. I prepared her a cool glass of water just as she requested, but I included an extra ingredient. People call it siren's blood, but that's just a pithy nickname. Its actual components are far worse. It glowed a bright pink as it mixed into the glass, but all it took was some light stirring to render it downright invisible. She didn't seem to notice anything off when she took her first sip, but then she was struck by a sudden lightheadedness, the glass falling from her hand. How are you feeling? Better? I asked. I'm feeling... She fell silent, her eyes losing focus as if gazing out at something a million miles in the distance. And I'd seen it, dozens of times before. The way all thoughts, all inhibitions leave the mind of whoever consumes the stuff. Still, it never stopped sending shivers up my spine, and that's when I began to test it. Juna, go ahead and raise both hands in front of your face. And she did, without a second thought. Lower them. Again, she did, like a robot obeying its programming. By now, her blank eyes were glowing a vibrant pink, with drool dribbling down her chin. I pushed up a table and slid her a typed document and a blank piece of notebook paper, side by side. Please copy the contents of the document onto this piece of paper, in your own handwriting. I don't really remember exactly what it said. Some bullshit I wrote about how she'd relapsed, and all the therapy was doing nothing for her depression, ending with those 3 words, I'm so sorry. At the time, I never thought about how painful the letter would be to actually read. To wonder why you didn't see the warning signs, whether you could have done more, whether you could have stopped it. I'd written the words that would devastate an entire family with the exact same aloof detachment you would feel while filling out paperwork. Once she was finished writing, I carefully slid her note away from her, and then, with gloved hands, laid a .32 revolver on the table. Now pick up the revolver, and she did. Place the barrel against the back of your throat, and she did. Now, pull the trigger. I wish I could tell you I was racked by guilt as I watched her splatter her own brains across the wall, but you want to know the truth? I didn't feel a goddamn thing. Once you've mired yourself neck deep in evil, convinced yourself it's all just a means to an end, the shit you'd have once found unforgivable became routine. After all, after making over 100 sacrifices in the name of the greater good, what's one more body on the pile? But now, at the end of it all, every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. I know no one will believe this. I know they'll send a squad to kill me for even saying this. I know I'll deserve it. I know I still won't make it easy for them. If you leave with one takeaway, let it be this. You know those old rumors about men in black suits, skulking around UFO crash sites and cursed arcade cabinets or whatever, and disappearing the witnesses? You know those kitschy conspiracy theories you laughed at and dismissed as out of hand? I want you to know that they're all too real, and if you want any chance of surviving an encounter with them alive, you have to remember, no matter what they try to tell you, they are not the good guys. And they're not your friends. They're zealots, a death cult single-mindedly devoted to the status quo, and they will happily kill you and everyone you love to make sure it persists. And behind the curtain, they've been working to bend every government, every police force, every national power you know and trust to become mired in that evil, complicit in their madness to run our society the way these monsters that call themselves men see fit. And they're winning. Quod necesse est facimus.